good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me welcome you to the Digital UK and Ireland FP&A board. My name is Olga Rudakova. I'm a FP&A professional, dashboard design trainer, and FP&A board ambassador. I'm happy to be your facilitator for tonight. Topic of the event is how to master rolling forecasts. And this topic attracted over 300 registrations from 31 different countries. Let me walk you through the agenda for the event. Before that, let me show you the list of the previous events. A broad collection of different events from different areas of FP&A. And I hope that tonight's session will be a good addition to this collection. We can expect. Tonight we'll speak about 3 stages of rolling forecasts maturity. We'll speak how we can apply rolling forecast logic to long-term strategic planning. Transition from traditional budgeting to rolling forecast. We'll speak about the role of technology in rolling forecasts. We'll have conclusions and recommendations, and certainly Q&A session. Now, it is my pleasure and honor to introduce our speakers for the evening. Please join me here on the webcam, and I will start with you, Sonia. Sonia Moscatelli is a finance director at eBay Global Advertising Finance. Sonia has 15-year international experience across finance and controlling functions. Sonia, we are very happy to have you with us tonight.
Thanks, Olga. Glad to be here.
Let me introduce our second speaker for the evening, Mehdi Benani. Mehdi is Director for Corporate FP&A at Booking.com. Mehdi has over 15 years of international experience in finance at the country and corporate level. Mehdi, thank you for joining tonight.
Thanks, Olga. Thanks for the rest of the panel, and happy to meet everyone.
Great. And last speaker for the evening will be Paul Houghton. Paul is the Regional Director for UK and Ireland at Jedox. Paul has over 30 years of experience overall, and 20 of them with enterprise performance management, business intelligence, data warehouses, and other technology areas. Paul, for being here with us.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me along. Looking forward to it.
Oh, I'm looking forward tonight as well. Let me briefly introduce FP&A Trends Group to all of you. You all know FP&A board in 27 cities, countries. But besides that, it is FP&A education, online resources, global webinars and workshops. And more than that, FP&A strategic advisory and research. Be sure to explore all the facets of it. Tonight, we will be part of 90-minute webinar. You will participate in 4 different polls connected to the subject. You're more than welcome to take part in the interactive Q&A session. You can start right away. Use Q&A box and type your question. Networking. Certainly, you're more than welcome to connect directly to our speakers through LinkedIn. Presentation of the event is already available in handouts, and you will receive of the presentation very soon after the meeting. Please don't leave without taking a part in a brief survey after this session, because your feedback is very important and helps us improve. Let me thank our sponsor for the event, Jedox, is a modern enterprise performance management, the smartest platform for planning, reporting, and analytics. To the topic of the webinar, before we jump into practical implementation, let's take a step back and look at rolling forecast as such. Let's remind ourselves what it is. Here at this slide, you see an example of 5 quarterly rolling forecast. What does that mean? It means that always we have an outlook for 5 quarters ahead. So when we start financial year, we have this forecast for 5 quarters. When we move on and first quarter ends, we replace the first quarter with actuals, we reforecast, and we add another quarter at the end to constantly have this 5 quarter outlook. So that means that when we are 3 quarters ahead in our current financial year, have the full visibility for the upcoming year. It allows us to transition between years without losing this visibility. This road to rolling forecast takes some time to transition. And we distinguish 3 different stages of rolling forecast maturity. The first stage, basic stage, basically relies on traditional forecasts. You might experiment with rolling forecasts already, but these remain pilot stage. Then you move on to the intermediate stage. That's when you have 2 parallel forecasts running. You have a traditional forecast, but you already have established rolling forecast. At the advanced stage, you actually rely solely on rolling forecasts. With these transitions, not only forecast horizon changes. Parallel with that, we see improvement in modeling, from static model to driver-based model. We see improvement in collaboration, from minimal collaboration to high collaboration. We see this transition from basic analytics to advanced analytics, essentially, from highly manual process to automated process, and from Excel to forecasting to FP&A system. Let's see where we are. Let's have a to how you have it in your organizations. And let me ask you a question. My question is, what is the best description of your current forecasting process? Option can be, we do not do any planning forecasting. Second option, we rely on traditional budgeting. Third option, we use both traditional budgets and rolling forecasts. And last option, we use just rolling forecasts. Let me see. We don't forecast, traditional budgets only, traditional budgets and rolling forecasts only. Majority of you have voted, so let's close this poll and share results with you. What do we see? Absolute majority of you, 52%, was traditional budgets and rolling forecasts. And another 45% rely on traditional budgeting so far. That's quite expected. I'm very happy that many of you are already playing this rolling forecast, that you already have it in good enough stage. So certainly this is for you. Let me move on, close these polling results and move on to our short discussion. At this stage, I will ask our panelists to join me here for this short discussion. Quite a tricky question. How far should we look ahead in our rolling forecasts, and how to decide on that? Let me start with you, Maggie, on this one. What do you think?
Thanks, Olga. I think I would stay a bit traditional in this one and go for a 6-quarter rolling forecast to start with. However, the first couple of months, potentially 1 to 2 quarters, it could be monthly. So, for example, you could have the first 6 quarters with a monthly rolling forecast, and the rest of the quarters, which are 4 quarters ahead. So it's quarterly. And this is basically coming to the next part of the question, how to decide on that. It's really based on what's the need of the organization and how they are affected by external factors. So that could define if, for example, the first quarter could be monthly or 2 quarters to be monthly. But overall, I would still stick with a 6 quarters rolling.
Very good. I think that's the most frequent answer so far. And I really like how we actually distinguish this granularity, that level of detail. So probably we don't need every part of this forecast to be detailed yet. Really nice answer, Mehdi. What do you think, Paul? How far should we look ahead?
I think it depends on the industry actually that you operate in. In certain industries, you'd be able to do exactly what Mehdi said, and you'd be able to look at maybe, you know, looking at over 6, 12, 18 months and breaking things down on a quarterly basis. If you're in a retail industry, then that's not going to be working particularly well for you. You're probably going to be having to forecast almost on a weekly basis for certain aspects of what you do. So I think it all depends on the industry that you operate in and how you operate currently, and move from that point of view.
Right. I know what you're speaking about, have experience with retail industry. And let me move on to you, Sonia. What do you think? How far should we look ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Olga. I think there's no one size fits all, right? And the flexibility is quite important because some time window that may work at some point may be relevant later on. So typically in my case, as we try to evolve the business and we drive a strategic shift, we typically would look into even a further ahead window up to 3 years. So of course, we don't do that every month, right? But this is a time window that we would use for the key drivers, the key business drivers, to ensure that we are trending relatively close to what we expect. So quite some flexibility there.
Right, and actually, I can't wait for you, Sonia, to elaborate on that in your presentations, because that's exactly we are going to. And we are moving to the first question about rolling forecasts. Why do we need to move? And how to apply rolling forecast logic to our long-term strategic planning. And who else can tell us about it better than Sonia Moscatelli? Sonia will be speaking about from rolling forecast to long-term strategic planning. Sonia, the stage is yours.
Thank you, Olga, and hi, everyone. Glad to be here to discuss this important topic. And I think Olga did a great job at setting the ground around rolling forecast. And I would like to share experience we have at eBay, especially as at this point, we have not formally moved and adopted rolling forecast. However, we are in the process of rethinking the way we forecast to see how we can make it more relevant, address the business need, and support better decision making down the road. So I'd like to start discussing the time horizon. With COVID, over the past couple of years, we saw a lot of change around the time horizon. So we always kept the annual budgeting and the monthly forecasting process as the core of financial planning. But at the same time, we saw initially when COVID started an increased focus on weekly flash forecast. There was highly volatile business environment. A lot of decisions could be made, a lot of risk and opportunities could be addressed real time. And back then it was highly relevant to look at the business weekly, if not daily, to assess and identify emerging trends and address them timely. At the same time, with the increased volatility in the short term, we actually have more need to look longer term in the 3 to 5 year strategic period. Because with such an uncertain short term, it can drive significantly different longer term outlook. And the way I think about it is really that balancing all those different time windows and having faster turnaround is actually pushing us in the direction of rolling forecast. So if we move to the next slide, Olga, I want to share more about why the traditional financial cycles are under pressure in the business environment that I'm evolving in. The first component is volatility. So we saw an extremely high volatile time for the past couple of years, and we really have to adjust real time to emerging business trends to capitalize on opportunities and mitigate risk. So to give you a few examples that we've been facing with COVID, but also associated items, we saw a lot of constraint around import and export corridors. We saw changing in the supply chain constraints, but also, quite frankly, change in the buyer needs. And while those trends can be extremely short term, it's also driving the longer term view. And this is shaping the performance. So the sooner we can identify those trends and bring the insight, the better equipped management is to take actions. The second important item is also the fact that traditional budgeting cycles is taking longer and longer. Typically, in my experience, it takes 3 to 6 months and most often closer to 6 to lock a budget forecast. If you consider dependency between the businesses and all the approval, the globalization, it's an extremely tedious process. And there's two challenges with that, right? The first one is that while you are busy budgeting, you may miss on some opportunity to execute timely during the rest of the year in process. The second challenge is that after 6 months working through a forecast, the budget is quickly obsolete because the broader context has changed, right? And one very simple example that we're experiencing now is with the great resignation. We need to be more agile in how we choose the geographical allocation of resources, which may have some implication as well in what we have in the plan and require us to adjust to meet new needs and new opportunities as well. The third item is the expected agile financial planning. What we saw is that there is less focus on prediction and more the forecasting and the financial planning is expected to bring data-driven insight that will assist decision-making and drive business outcome. This also results in shorter and faster turnaround time, which are adding pressure on the finance organizations. Finally, which is really important to me, is the increased focus on long-term strategic planning. So in my case, we are really driving a fast-growing part of the eBay business, advertising, and we are also pivoting the strategy, and it requires us to really look forward on a regular basis, and the time window has accelerated. While we used to look at 3 to 5 year planning once a year, we now have to adjust, build scenario, assess the drivers, and provide insight on a more frequent basis. This is also tied to investment profile because the current process, the traditional process, is also creating some pressure in terms of resources allocation and investment profile, missing potentially on some opportunities to adjust promptly and ensure that we are tracking and shaping the business in a way that is consistent with the long-term strategy. So what are the challenges on the road to rolling forecast? Keeping in mind that for me, the priority is to make rolling forecast relevant to the business, right? It should really start with the business needs and be addressed and built in such a way that it's enabling the business to make better decisions faster and to act on emerging trends. So the first challenge we are facing is organizational alignment. In complex, global, and matrix organization, this alignment is critical to pivot towards a rolling forecast. And when I think about alignment, it's within the different finance function, which is already quite a significant task, but it's also with the business partners and to convince them about the value and how this can ultimately be a better tool for them to plan. The second challenge is annual investment cycle. At eBay, we are still bound to the annual funding, strictly speaking, and this is also creating the need to come up with more assumptions and scenario planning because we have dependency on the funding. However, this is also an opportunity in my mind because if you think about the rolling forecast, you will be better positioned to prepare the funding discussion and to come with better relevant insight, given that you have started modeling the investment profile earlier on and already have a few quarters of experience on how much incrementality those can drive. The final item is finance resourcing. Finance is a support function in most organizations, and this is something I'm experiencing as well. Given the increased ask for agility, faster turnaround, volatility in the business environment, it's challenging to find time and resources to build a robust rolling forecast from the scratch up to deploy it. And while we expect efficiency gains down the road, there is a short-term investment and upfront investment that is challenging to deliver on. So what steps are we taking towards rolling forecast? Our objective is really to think about providing greater visibility into future outcome, identify risk and opportunities, inform and influence strategic and operational decision. So with that, we are taking a gradual approach to meet the business needs, but also to present the rolling forecast as a dot connector between the different parts of the organization. Rolling forecast would need to be simple and objective. So we decided to split it into three aspects, which we can action and go to the right level of detail depending on the business environment. The first one is the baseline. Baseline is really the underlying business health. So here we use business drivers and we try to really keep the efficient updating of that baseline. In the short term, it's not very actionable. In the long term, it can be interesting to shape longer term strategic decision. The second pillar is the core group dependencies. Working in eBay advertising, we have high dependence against the eBay e-commerce platform. So we need to work very closely with the rest of the organization, avoid duplication, and ensure that the assumptions are aligned together. Here again, less action and less actionability in the short term. So the objective is really to be efficient. Where we actually devote most of the time and resources is on investment and initiatives. This is the most actionable part of the business, and this is where we have a lot of latitude to play with the planning, to reassign, reprioritize, shift resources and investment as needed to address the business need. This is where it's critical to identify emerging trend and risk. So we have always a relevant running list and playbook of opportunities that we can action as needed to cover gaps, both on the initiative and investment side, but also if you go down to the core business health, you may also action some initiatives and investment that can actually go back and timely reflect on those risks. So in conclusion, moving to running forecast should really start with a business need. And if it's used properly, it's well prioritized and based on the right drivers, it can really become a powerful dynamic window in the future to influence business decision rather than predict what is coming naturally out of the circumstances.
Right. Thank you so much, Sonia, for your presentation. And thank you for telling us how we actually can bring together addressing our current business needs and long-term outlook to the future. If you have any questions to Sonia, it's very good time to ask them through our question box, and we will address them at the end of the session. Meanwhile, let me ask you a question. My dear audience, let me launch another polling question because we want to have another sneak peek into your organizations and see what do you reforecast in your rolling forecast update. So maybe you reforecast all the line items or only items that are significant. Maybe even only items that are significant and volatile. And another option is we don't reforecast at all. So let's see how many line items, if you reforecast all the line items in your rolling forecasts. All of them, only significant and volatile, and no reforecasting at all. I can't wait to see your results. So let me close this poll and let me share these results with you. What do we see? We see that most of you, 43%, reforecast only items that are significant. Now the big portion of participants, 30%, only reforecasts items that are significant and volatile. 23% reforecast all the items, and only 4% don't reforecast at all. Sonia, let me ask you for a very brief comment to the poll. Is it something that you have expected?
Yeah, I expected the significant, and I think there's a trick in the question as well, right? Because you would only focus on volatile item as long as they are significant. So I think that's not super surprising. And I would definitely, in my experience, also focus on items that are significant, volatile, and also to some extent emerging, because they may become more relevant in the future. We are trying to move away from forecasting all line items and focusing on the main drivers, because it's diluting to some extent. It can be dilutive of the end value of the forecast ultimately.
Right. Thank you for answer. Let me hide this polling result and let me move to the next part of the session, again a mini discussion with all our participants. And the question for this one is how to make sure that rolling forecasts do not become just another time-consuming, non-value added activities. Let me ask all our panelists to join me here on the webcam with their microphones, and we can discuss how to make sure that rolling forecasts are not another time-consuming exercise. And let me start with you, Paul. What do you think?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, I think organisations have got to decide on what it is that they want to achieve with regards to that rolling forecast, and whether or not they decide actually this is, now's the appropriate time for them to do it. Like any new solution, any new process, if you start on it with the wrong basis for moving forward in the first place, for going into it, you're not going to succeed. And I think Sonia's approach, which was effectively, looking at the business outcome in the first place, is something we're starting to see a lot of. We're talking to a lot of people initially about what it is that their business is looking for in terms of an outcome before we even get in closer to talking about technology. So I would definitely echo that whole approach, and make sure that ultimately the process, the sort of thing that you're looking at here with regards to this, is something that's critical, that's really important to the business, and you get sponsorship as well with it.
Right. Thank you for your answer, and let me pass it on to you, Mehdi. How to make sure it's not another time-consuming activity?
Yeah, thanks, Olga. I will tackle the question from the keywords that are there. So first of all, on the time consuming, especially for the folks that are that have just transitioned into rolling forecasts or are in the process of doing so, that's yes, at the first time it might be time consuming to just do the transition. However, there is a learning curve there, right? And as long as we move away from that sort of one-off budget exercise that takes 3 to 6 months, as Sonia said, it becomes more of a regular FP&A activity throughout the year. So you sort of spread that resource and FP&A efforts into throughout the year. And apply that sort of learning curve. When it comes to the non-value added activity, we as FP&A professionals are good at providing the insights and not just the numbers, and earn a seat on the table. So as long as the forecast is always supported by the right analysis, we will always be engaged and be asked by senior leadership to be solicited for provide the outcome of the forecast, but also that we earn a seat on the table based on the insights we provide out of the outcome of the forecast.
Right, thank you. And thank you for stressing out our role as finance professionals in adding this value to forecasts. Back to you, Sonia. What do you think? How can we avoid that?
Yeah, I mean, business need is absolutely critical, right? It needs to be a collective effort and bringing value to ultimately drive outcome, as Mehdi mentioned. Now, when it comes to time consuming, I think it needs to be done in a way that is actually coming instead of some of the current practice, so we can really pivot from one to the other rather than duplicate and do both. Because I think there is this temporary state where you do both, which is extremely time consuming, which is also the time when you are building, right? But down the road, it should be actually more efficient and done in a way that is scalable and also relevant and globalized, and ultimately potentially drive efficiency down the road, because you can merge step and process and build it in a way that is highly flexible.
Right, right. Okay, I really like these answers, and let me move on to actually practical implementation of rolling forecasts. So we'll speak about how to transition. And the person who will tell us about this approach will be Mehdi Benani. Mehdi will speak about transition from traditional budgeting to rolling forecasts. Mehdi, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Olga. And let me take the next 10 minutes or so and try to share with you my experience with moving from traditional budgeting into a rolling forecast, or a hybrid model between rolling forecast and scenario planning. And as you can see in the slide, traditional budgeting, you often see a budget that is used for forecasting with the aim to achieve multiple purposes. First of all, you want to achieve a forecast, and a forecast needs to be realistic or affordable. But at the same time, there is a target setting on top, or what is derived from a traditional budgeting process. And targets need to be competitive and ambitious. And there is already a conflict between the purpose of the forecast and the purpose of the targets. And then lastly, there is an investment allocation, how you allocate your investments or opportunities. And all of that is in one cycle within the traditional budgeting approach. Another inherent shortcoming is that usually it's updated quarterly, and it's quite lengthy. And I fully agree with Sonia that it might take anything between 3 and 9 months to get into the final version towards September or October. Sometimes it's stretched until December of the year. And the challenge there is, until that period, you do have a blind spots where you have no visibility on next year forecast or numbers until actually you go through the budget cycle. The other elements that we suffered through was the slow adaptation to market conditions. So the planning cycle was quite rigid and quite long. And imagine throughout the cycle, you've already spent 3 months in doing a lot of alignments, operational planning, you are into financial planning, and there is a significant shift in market conditions. So it becomes actually quite hard in the middle of the cycle to do a new iteration of the budget. Lastly, the business might come up with a list of opportunities or investments, and you could be missing out an opportunity by not having a solid structure in place on how to identify, prioritize, and allocate investments. With that, moving to the next slide. So when we move into a rolling forecast scenario, and when we also had that transition in place, it's different in a sense, as also Olga mentioned, usually add a quarter at each cycle. It could be more. We have seen a move away from a traditional sort of all-in forecast and have a mix of centralized and decentralized approach. This required from us doing a deep dive into what the baseline forecast is. So I quite aligned with what also Sonia mentioned, and have clear definition of what the baseline and how we get into the baseline forecast. That can also be derived centrally with low efforts from the organization, and a lot of modeling from FP&A folks, also using some of the macro assumptions, while the investment part or the incremental parts are more bottom-up and decentralized. And this is for better decision making, but also ownership of the plans by the business. The use of planning tools have been crucial, first to move away from dozens of Excel models into a more flexible planning tool, and Paul will dive into that later on in this section. And lastly, allocate funds in a much better and structured way to the right opportunities, but also there are ones who did not make it to the final plans. What do we do with those? So what happened in a rolling forecast scenario is to have a list. In our case, we call it on the shelf. Then this list is reviewed on a quarterly basis based on market dynamics, but also how we are beating or not beating the plan, and incorporate some of the on the shelf in a much more structured manner. Going next. So now, how to ensure a smooth transition, and here are some practical steps that you can follow to transition into rolling forecast, or you can take some examples from how we've done it, and it starts with identifying the goals and communicate to relevant stakeholders. And at this stage, I would always say over communicate is better than the opposites here. Especially when it comes to making a transition from one approach into the other. As you have seen in the previous slide, we had to segregate between the three pillars of planning that we had, right? So you have the target setting, the forecast, rolling forecast, and investment allocation, but also how they are interlinked in one integrated planning cycle. As Sonia mentioned in answering one of the questions, was that the rolling forecast should not come on top of what you've done, right? So once you have this process in place and you have a rolling forecast and it's time to set targets for next year, you don't start from scratch, because as you can imagine in a rolling forecast, if you have a six quarters or 18 months ahead, usually the 12 months period of next year is already there. So you can leverage on that and build some additional targets on top. In the case of booking, we've also created a planning documents. We've shared it widely with budget holders. Remember that not all budget holders have deep FP&A knowledge, so it's important to explain the why and the how of the change and how it will happen and how it will affect the budget holders in the organization, which is not necessarily sitting in finance or in FP&A. Remember that not only you could transition from traditional budgeting to rolling forecast, but you could also change how you forecast, whether you are doing it in traditional budgeting or in rolling forecast. You could be applying zero-based budgeting, for example, and the next year you might want to transition into a baseline/investments approach, right? So this is also a change that is also good to document in a planning document and share it quite early in the process, because it might affect how you will receive the outputs from the business and how you would process it. In the latest situation with the impact from COVID, you might also go for a hybrid solution where you could use zero-based budgeting for some line items and an investment/baseline for other line items. Again, all of that is good to document and have these documents updated on a regular basis and share widely with your organization. Lastly, I would mention that this can be a significant change, especially for the ones who plan on making that full transition from a traditional long year budgets. So apply change management tools throughout the change program. As I mentioned, sometimes it's good and it's better to over communicate in the beginning. Have a good cadence of meetings, and for us it was quite useful. Especially with the business operations stakeholders in the business throughout the change, have a good cadence that could be monthly or bi-monthly basis to make sure that they are well aware of how we are making the transition, but also how it will affect them when it comes to providing their budget to the FP&A counterparts. Going next. So now, once we have done a good communication and everyone knows how to work with the new approach, we need to consider time horizon and the time increment needed. In the case of booking, the keyword is flexibility, and it was even more important to move to an agile way of forecasting than purely transitioning into a quarterly rolling forecast. This is, it's crucial that it should be enabled by technology, but we'll come to that later. But here is an illustration of the frequency that is updated. So revenue, for example, is updated with actuals on a weekly basis, and trend analysis is automatically updated based on the latest actuals, which is then feeding the baseline forecast in a much more automated manner. In some industries like travel, the impact of an external event, whether it's it's a war, or in the case of COVID, or a country announcing restrictions, the impact is immediate, right? And we start to see a sharp increase in cancellation rates in our case, and at the same time a sharp decrease of new bookings in the affected countries. So waiting for the next month or the next quarter to reforecast is not adding much value, and we as FP&A professional are not supporting the business by just waiting for the next quarter to give them the impact of a new variance that took place 2 months ago. So some goes with marketing spend. In our case, it goes hand in hand with revenue. So the frequency is also weakening. However, when we move into the OPEX line items, then we can afford to have more of a monthly updates of the forecast. And going into CapEx, then the updates of the forecast can be done on a biannual basis. And of course, based on the companies you operate in, this can be different. So in companies that are more heavy on the asset side, the CapEx update might become weekly instead of biannual. But the idea here is that you adopt a flexible approach based on the sector you operate in. Next slide, Olga, please. Thanks. So the third element that is crucial on deploying the appropriate technologies and processes, few elements that were applied in the case of booking were around. First of all, moving to a driver-based approach. This is super crucial when it comes to, for example, revenue forecast, or another example is forecasting staff costs at the lowest level of the organization. So you might be forecasting today, in the example of staff costs, based on, let's say, a traditional cost center by FTE, but you could also move to a workforce planning where you forecast at the lowest level of the organization. You also add more drivers when it comes to attritions, new hires, and you could also forecast based on, down to, I wouldn't say individuals, but almost job role level. So you could have that sort of connected or workforce planning connected to your rolling forecast to be much more accurate and have a driver-based fixed staff cost forecasting. At the end, you need to find the right balance between speed, agility, and accuracy of the forecast. What you see in the flowchart below is actually an illustration of how revenue forecasting was performed prior to moving to APM tooling. A lot of drivers, but also a lot of outputs illustrated by sort of the gray box. And the green boxes are actually the different outcomes that were in the form of Excel files. So no less than 18 or even 20 Excel files were used in order to move from gross transaction number that need to be by channel, by country, etc., in order to move all the way through the funnel and then go and reach sort of a revenue number. So all were offline submissions. It will take a couple of hours to redrive if there was a change in one of the assumptions, and you can imagine the rest of FP&A waiting for a final outcome. As you know, revenue is also used as a driver for other line items in the P&L. So it was quite hectic and time consuming. While today that's part of history, as revenue forecasting is entirely automated with all the steps in between. The time to process went down from a couple of hours to a couple of minutes. Plus the ability to add on more quarters became effortless. So that trend analysis over whatever quarters we want to put becomes quite automated. So consider moving to cloud-based technologies that enables easy adjustments of your models, or even allowing subservice modeling, depending on the tool you would pick, to fit the change in your business. And Paul will share more on how you can do that and the benefits of such transition. Moving next. The fourth element and the last one. So once you have deployed the right technology stack and process, it's also important to establish scenario planning and sensitivity analysis modeling. In nowadays, it's actually quite hard to decouple rolling forecast and scenario modeling, or I would even go and say that rolling forecast without scenario modeling start to become a little bit useless. So both have to go hand in hand for a much better value to your organization. COVID-19 has, disturbed many companies in many sectors, and this has pushed certainly companies in the travel industry to move also into scenario modeling. And here is an example on almost close to live modeling, where while we go through the rest of the 2020 forecast, one of the metrics, The colors you see and the lines, these are actually different scenarios, and there were no less than 9 scenarios with different interpretation on the latest Omicron, right? So we're at the end of the Omicron, and then we were questioning, right, what would be the impact then, and what scenarios, and how quickly we should recover, or how far we should recover from it. Should we plan for another wave towards the end of the year or not, right? All of these scenarios, we had to go through them and quickly come up with recommendations for senior leadership, right? And more importantly is you have a table on the side of the slide to see immediately when you go for one or the other scenario, what's the impact you see versus versus a baseline year, or what's the impact on your EBITDA, right? So that this is all enabled by you know, the right technology stack, but it's super crucial to always have flexibility there, so that when this is needed, you can pull scenario modeling and add even more value to your stakeholders. So I think I will conclude with this sentence. Especially in 2020, has taught us, if it has taught us anything, it's that, you know, things change. So the economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 had significant impacts on traditional annual plans. On in this picture, you know, standard routes with point A to point B. First, current plans were rendered completely useless, or, you know, especially you start to plan based on a variance, and then through the cycle you get another variance, or you get, you know, a new war that is impacting a couple of countries that are critical in your forecast. And the only way for companies to navigate forward and still achieve existing goals, and for some companies even survival, would be exploring multiple potential changes, right? And that's why the GPS comes in place, because it will always give you alternative routes, and sometimes going into unknown terrain. So such scenario building and agility is the foundation of the rolling forecast.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Olga.
Thank you, Mehdi, for your nice presentation. And I certainly prefer a GPS when driving and when forecasting. My dear audience, if you want to ask Mehdi a question, it's very good time to do so. Use your question box. If you want to ask question to any other participant, still it's good time to do so. Use this question box. And we are moving on to the next polling question to you. I want to ask all of you, how long is your current forecasting cycle? We do not any planning and forecasting could be, or it's longer than a month, it's longer than 1 week, or it's less than a week. Let's see how long forecasting cycle takes in different organizations. Longer than a month, longer than 1 week, or less a week. Can't wait to see your answers. So let me close this polling question and let me share the results with you. We see the majority of you, almost 50%, plan or forecast for longer than a month. Another big portion, almost 40%, spend more than 1 week on the rolling forecast. And another 13% spend less than a week on that. Mehdi, what do you think? What do you think about poll results? Is it something that you have expected?
I think it's kind of expected, also based on the first poll, when we saw more or less same percentage are still on the traditional budgeting approach, and typically, as we've all said, it does take a couple of months to go through the budget cycle. So that percentage is quite aligned. The ones that are transitioning into rolling forecasts or are more used to more frequent update of the forecast, it also makes sense that it will take about a week or a couple of weeks to go and you know, through the process end to end. So not surprised with the results.
Right. Certainly that makes sense. And let us move on to a short mini discussion between all of you. The question will be, how frequently should we reforecast and how to make this decision? And let me start with you, Sonia.
Yeah, thanks, Olga. And I think there the way I think about it is also applying flexibility. So in my experience, we would typically reforecast once or twice a quarter. However, we'll be agile in how far ahead we forecast. We would not systematically forecast for like 2 years period or 6 quarters ahead. It may be a light touch. So that will depend on the broader business environment and how actionable it may be, and how far off we are versus where we want to be. So quite some flexibility here, and I think it's good to leave the door open, basically to apply to what's most relevant in a given point in time.
Right. Mehdi, what do you think? How frequently should we reforecast?
Yeah, I agree with Sonia, and I mentioned in my presentation a table that shows revenue forecasting is done weekly while CapEx is done biannually. So you can see that there is a wide range of reforecasting period. Actually, to take it to the next step, FP&A need to be ready and equipped to reforecast, I would say, live and on demand, based on whatever situation and ask from the business, but also reacting to the markets, or not even reacting, predicting the markets scenarios as well, and have the right process in place, technology, in order to be able to turn a request in in a couple of hours and have a quick updates of some of the key drivers or line items and reforecast on a live basis, right? In actuals closing, we are now talking about a live closing or daily closing as a new way of closing the books. And I think in forecasting we are also kind of transitioning into being able to do a live update of the budgets or the forecast. Sorry.
Right. Thank you. And I see Paul nodding to that about live forecasting. Paul, what do you think? How frequently should we reforecast?
Well, I think it all depends on the industry. It all depends on the type of business that you are and the scale of that business as well. You may move within any given period to a far more frequent forecast than you've been doing, recent time or a previous time. And that just may evolve depending upon the market conditions. As my colleagues said, things like COVID, things like the war in Ukraine mean that we've got to start thinking about doing forecasts on a far more frequent basis. The big question is almost, how do you make that decision? How do you involve the ultimate number of budget holders in that whole process and that whole discussion? And that becomes definitely a technology issue from that point of view as well. So it's about making sure that the solution that you've got in place to be able to move with your FP&A and extended planning requirements has that ability to involve and engage with multiple stakeholders, both at a high level, but also at the end user level. These should be potentially individuals out there in the field being able to do things on technology that they want to use, whether or not it's a mobile phone, an iPad, or something like that. How do they engage with that whole process and make it easy for them?
Right. And exactly on this technology solution, we will elaborate in our next presentation. We will speak about what can help with this transition, with rolling forecasts as such. And who else than Paul Houghton can tell us about the role of technology in rolling forecasts. Paul, the stage is yours.
Whenever you say that to me, I feel as though I should do a song and dance part at that point. I'll refrain from doing that, but thank you, Olga. That's very kind. So just to kind of let's look back in history as much as anything else. An awful lot of people that we talk to still today are using one of two different types of solutions. They're either using, I call it a generation one FP&A type of solution, something that going back to the days of S-Base maybe, or TM1. They were great in their day, but they're not cloud-based and they need enhancing, so they need flexibility to be able to do things. And the reality is those people that are still using that still use Excel on top of it. So that becomes quite a challenge. And if they're not using Excel on top of it, they're using Excel in its entirety throughout the business. And that's a challenge because, we did a survey quite recently and found that 80% of businesses were still heavily reliant upon using Excel. Now, Excel is brilliant as a single user productivity tool. We all love it. You could go out and build lots of different things with Excel. You could build a CRM system. You could build a ledger, but you wouldn't, because that's not the best use of its time from that point of view. And the challenge that people have, that businesses have, is that when they're ultimately then putting they're ultimately putting a spreadsheet-based solution out into their user population, they have no control of what's going on. So fairly typically, they send it out to tens, hundreds, potentially thousands of users. The first thing that people do is they save it locally, because they want to be able to make the changes themselves. They look at it and they say, well, I would have done that slightly differently. My calculation methodology would have been slightly different to the way that that's been done. So they tend to do that, and instantly you're out of sync. That's not a good scenario. So they make those changes, they input the data, they send it back, but the person at the center has no visibility of who's received, started, made changes, sent those back at all. So they receive all of that, and oh, by the way, they've now got to cut and paste from those change spreadsheets into a centralized one. That becomes a real problem in itself, because we're then talking about data, and cutting and pasting is fraught with all sorts of issues. So that in itself becomes a major headache. No, you don't know where people are within the process. They don't know what's been going on. And if we go on to my next slide, you'll see that how things have evolved. Things now are looking at, businesses want to be able to say, well, actually, yeah, I still want to be able to do this whole thing. I want to be able to have a centralized approach to it all. I want to have almost a central planning model, but I want to have some control and some rigor in terms of how that operates. So I'll send it out via email, but I actually get the users to complete all of that online. We'll use a browser, probably. That's going to be a slightly different thing. I can see what's happening within the business, so I can progress and see what I can monitor the progress and see how that's all developing. But going back to one of the things that Mehdi said, extensively earlier, there is a massive drive now within every organization to be able to do more and more scenario modeling. And that's becoming absolutely critical. So it's that ability to be able to do that means you can, if you've got a centralized solution, you can do that on the fly a lot more. You can then prepare the reports that you need to do to be able to send out and send out as board packs perhaps, or send those out in some sort of some sort of dashboarding, and that becomes really quite critical. So if we can go to the next slide, please, and I'll then start to talk to you about all the different things that as a business are starting to massively impact. And again, if we look at forecasting in its entirety, going back to January 2020, most people will have done what they always do, which is they do a budget, but they do it based on last year, and they up it by 5%. They started to build into February, maybe some sort of, if they got some sort of rolling forecast, they maybe had 1 month's actuals, and then they started to do a forecast. By March, everything was out of date. Everything. The pandemic changed everything in the way that we operated, the forecasting, and what we need to do. So the businesses now need to do far more strategic planning than they've ever done before. And things like we look at Ukraine and the situation there. Every single one of the businesses that I'm talking to today, they're going to have either transportation costs or utility costs that are changing significantly. As of the 24th of February, the business has changed, and you have to be able to model and be able to look at the strategic side of things from that point of view. The big challenge as well is that organizations are still saying to us, we need to be able to integrate with multiple different data sources. Some of those are cloud-based, some of them are much older systems that are out there. Oh, and by the way, there's still some people that have got a load of data that's hidden across in some spreadsheets on their desktops as well. They need to be able to integrate with all of those different aspects of the business, and that becomes really quite difficult. So ultimately, that whole decision making and the planning processes are becoming harder and harder for the business to get a really good bird's eye view and a perspective of what they're doing from that point of view. So that becomes, you know, really quite challenging. And then from the end user point of view, they want to be able to have very fast systems, solutions that are able to react to their needs really quickly, and the processes need to be really agile, and that becomes very critical. If we then move on to the next slide, one of the things that I wanted to talk about here, we're finding more and more there is a requirement to almost go towards real-time continuous planning. We touched on that earlier. We need to be able to do that at a far more granular level. So, you know, forecasting the frequency is absolutely critical. How are we doing that? We're doing that by making finance the catalysts for change, because businesses are now, and I think Mehdi touched on it earlier, are now starting to think, well, actually, how do I plan across my supply chain? How do I plan across my workforce? And what will be the impact on the next version of my plan and my forecast that I work with at the moment? So there is definitely a requirement to move from almost a high level approach to a far more granular approach as well. And moving from almost silo-based use of data to an integrated use of data across the whole of the business. And again, both of my colleagues, Sonia and Mehdi, touched on moving towards almost a lot more driver-based planning across the organizations as well. And that becomes really important. Businesses as well are saying to us, well, actually, there's a lot more algorithms that are out there that we need to start thinking about using those, and so that we can predict a lot better and maybe identify patterns in the data. We're starting to see a requirement for, you know, people asking about artificial intelligence, machine learning. Don't get me wrong, nobody comes to us and says the most important thing for me is machine learning and artificial intelligence. But what they want to do is think about how they're going to forecast going forward. They don't want to involve data scientists in this. They want finance individuals to be able to look at this whole process and say, well, actually, I'd like to be able to use the latest and greatest elements to that data science side of things. So, you know, I need to be able to think about whether or not I use artificial intelligence, but I don't want to be the expert around that. I want to be able to think about how it's being used throughout the business and the best way of using it for us. So if we move on to the next slide, you know, what do we need to be successful from a technology point of view? And I think the thing that's quite critical is that the management cycle itself really hasn't changed. You're still planning and managing your business like you've always done that. That hasn't changed. The processes, those haven't necessarily changed. But the strategy, moving down into financial plans and then operational plans, and then the operational plans are being executed more and then reported on, again, that hasn't changed. The analysis, the optimization of it, that hasn't changed. What has changed is the frequency. There is definitely a need to move towards more frequent planning and forecasting from that point of view. And you know, again, my colleagues touched on that. So that whole circle is just getting faster and faster. Additionally, and I touched on it with my answer previously, is that element of collaboration. You know, there's more people needing to be involved with the whole process, and FP&A, you know, individuals that drive the FP&A function are accountants. They're not data scientists. They didn't go and do all their accounting exams in the first place because they ultimately decided, I like to be able to build Excel-based models based on multiple data sources. They actually largely went to do all their accounting exams because they wanted to add value. They wanted to do the analysis aspects of things and add value on top of the plans and the financial data. So today, departments are moving across the whole of the value chain as well. So, you know, even more so. So they're moving from finance to sales through procurement, through human resources, and through supply chain. And the Office of Finance is really becoming the strategic advisor, and the company supports that ability to be able to make those decisions is really being driven by finance. But ultimately, you need the right technology to be able to do that. And it needs a collaborative approach moving across all sorts of different departments. And again, if we move on to the next slide, really in summary, what I would say is that as the business moves on, there is definitely this need towards transparency, to be far more dynamic, and to use almost assisted planning, AI assisted planning, for want of a better word, throughout the business. It should be wizard driven. It should be non-data scientist driven from that point of view, and you should be able to start thinking about adding value to the customer. Again, Sonia mentioned very early on that businesses will look at business outcomes. If you look at Project Management 101, the first thing that will be there is how do we what are we looking to measure? What are we looking to achieve by the whole of this? And one thing that we would always say to businesses, let's talk about the outcome that you're looking for. It doesn't really matter which technology provider you go for, but ultimately let's look at, from a project point of view, what is it that you're trying to achieve, and how shall we quantify that, so we can then we can articulate it, we can then quantify it from an economic point of view, and then we can start to look at an ROI. So then we're then starting to look at how and why do we take technology in the first place, and how will that improve that whole process. So that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for your presentation. I could not agree more. And you see that transition to rolling forecasts often more holistic change in your planning process, including the way you collaborate, including the technology you use. Let us move on for our last polling question for the session. The question will be, how mature is a technology that underpins your forecasting process? One option is, we don't do any planning and forecasting. We use Excel as our primary tool. We use traditional planning tools, or we use cloud-based enterprise performance management platform. What is your answer? Excel, traditional planning tools, or enterprise performance management platform? Let me close this poll and let me share the results with you. 64% we use Excel as our primary tool. 27% we use cloud-based EPM platform, and 9% we use traditional planning tools. Paul, what do you think? Is that expected result for you?
Sadly, it is. And I find it absolutely incredible every time. I would have thought that most organizations had moved towards the bottom one there, an EPM platform. What that clearly tells us is the survey that we did a while ago is still accurate and still very valid. That Excel is still that primary tool. Excel is brilliant as that single user tool. It's reasonable to say that that's the tool that we should still ask users, do they want to use that? But use it as an interface. Use it as the tool, whether or not that's Excel or whether or not that's, I don't know, Power BI or one of the other reporting tools like Click or Tableau, or something like that. It's something that they should be given the choice. That's how I do my planning. But the fact that 64% are still using Excel, it's frightening, isn't it, really, in 2022?
Indeed, indeed. Let me hide these results and let me engage our participants in the last mini discussion. How to avoid the short-term decision-making that results in organizations selecting a system today that they might regret. Mehdi, let me start with you here. What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Olga. And I'll take a practical example that we have been through. And the first advice here is make sure to go through a proof of concepts and pick an element of your forecasting cycle or a line item where you have most of the struggle and challenges. And I'm sure many players out there will be willing to come and show you how it can be done in a real life scenario, potentially, and in most of the cases also free of charge. And don't be afraid to reach out to many players. And talking about players in the market, there are many, and what I would say is, when you look for EPM providers, there are many out there that would claim, almost all players can claim that they can do everything. You have ERP solutions that claim to be good at forecasting. You have even sometimes data and analytics solution who claim that can do forecasting. And if you ask them, they will say, "Oh yes, we can do it." So make sure to go for a tool that their core capability is forecasting and planning, and not an auxiliary kind of attached service on top of what they would do. So that would be a practical tip that I would give. Another one is bring the end user into the proof of concepts. Let them also have a say and see how they would interact with the tool, and let them ask the right question also. For example, if your concern or one of your challenges is how to make changes to a driver, you can ask it during the POC and see what direction, how it is easy or complex to make such a change, right? If this is one of your key concern. So look at collaboration, for example. If collaboration is another element that is crucial for your planning cycle, then which tool is providing that sort of collaboration elements where you can collaborate, for example, inside the tool with other parties within FP&A or outside FP&A. So to summarize, to make sure that it's a one right time implementation, take the time and do a POC and take a decision later on.
Thank you, Mehdi. And let me move on to you, Sonia. Very briefly, how can we avoid this mistake and choose the right system today?
Yeah, thanks, Mehdi, for all the practical tips. I think that's super helpful. I would say on my side that the most important is to understand how it will fit within the resources. I think the most important investment as part of this shift is people and the finance organization, but broader organization. So understanding how that will impact and how that can actually be ultimately efficient. Right, so that's the ultimate item to keep in mind. And more broadly, having a flexible system that can allow to start small and grow big or adapt to constantly evolving situation is the second item I would prioritize.
Right. Thank you, Sonia, so much for your answer. And back to you, Paul. What do you think? How can we choose the right system today?
I totally agree with all of those aspects. To a certain extent, this is a crowded marketplace. There's a lot of people that can operate and can suggest that they've got an FP&A solution. And Mehdi's absolutely right. There's lots of, particularly ERP vendors will say, we can do it, and we'll bundle it as part of another solution. So you're not really paying for it. You are paying for it. You're paying for it in terms of implementation. And it comes down to how quickly is this solution going to be implemented. I would, if I was looking now, I'd be saying, I want to get a really strong feel for the people. That's trust. You need to be comfortable that the solution provider, the people are going to be there. You want to make sure that ultimately the technology it will integrate with everything. And I don't just mean, can it be shown on a demonstration or a proof of concept? Actually, is that a core strength to the business, the technology provider? And Mehdi's point was very apt. A lot of organizations will offer a proof of concept. In my experience, it's very easy for an organization to say, okay, we've got 2 weeks for that demonstration to happen. What is it that we're trying to show? And they have a raft of consultants behind the scenes building something out. So when the demonstration comes, it looks great. It looks just like I wanted it to do. Yeah, because you had 30 people building it in the background. That's not the best solution for a prospect. It doesn't matter how big or small you are. I would suggest the best thing you can do is to say to the companies that you're talking to, all of them, that literally the morning or a couple of hours before you're about to send it, say, I'm going to ask you a question on the day. I'm going to send through my spreadsheets. What I've currently got, I'm going to send those through to you. And I'm not going to do it until we start the call. So if the call's at 2 o'clock, we start the call at 2 o'clock, you press the button and send the spreadsheet through. That's going to be a real test how quickly the company can take your data, can read it, and can make it cloud enabled and get you a really quick win. That's the best test you can possibly do. That makes it tough. I can tell you from a pre-sales point of view, my pre-sales colleagues will be going, oh crikey, but in reality, you'll get a really good picture for how easy it is for the provider to do things with your information and do things on the fly, and you'll get a much better feel for it.
Thank you, Paul, for your tips. I think it's quite a good piece of advice for all of us choosing a new system. And I have to say that we have so many questions today that I suggest we jump right into the Q&A session to attempt to answer at least some of them. And let me start with you, Sonia, right away. There is a question addressed to you. I like the idea of having a waiting group for risks and opportunities. Do you have a prescriptive way of determining what moves from waiting room to the forecasts, or it is a dark art? So how do you decide what to move from the waiting room to the real forecast?
Yeah, that's a very relevant question, right? And I think the first thing is we need to always have that list, and that's difficult. It requires a lot of discipline. And how to decide what we move, I think a lot is driven by external factors and also organization, right? I mean, part of it is driven by constraint that we have externally, or a product that is taking more time to build or delivering less, or some resources allocated to a certain project will take longer. So then we need to be agile in how we shift. And this is kind of a constant replanning process, right? Where we need to adjust and have that list always to be able to juggle, right? But it's a lot of judgment. I think there's no one size fits all, but it's really about having the mindset to constantly get back to the list and pushing the business to keep that list up to date, so that we can drive actions.
Right. Thank you. Mindset and human mind is key in this area. Maggie, let me ask you the next question. It is addressed directly to you. Thank you for your presentation. Please, can you confirm your approach to target setting within a rolling forecast approach?
Yeah, thanks. Very valid question, and there it's really important that you don't start your target setting from scratch as another independent cycle, as also Sonia mentioned. When you are into, let's say, the second quarter of the year, you potentially have a view of your baseline forecast of the following year. So when it comes to the target setting, make sure that you use this baseline forecast. Make sure to validate this baseline to be used for the target setting for next year. And on top of that, you would need to have few iteration with your leadership team and also with finance leadership to see how much additional stretch and targets you want to put on top, right? Because targets need to be ambitious, need to be encouraging people to outperform, while the baseline forecast that is coming out of your rolling forecast needs to be more realistic and more close to reality. So my advice there is use it as a base for your target setting process, and don't start your targets from scratch and replanning. That's definitely what needs to be avoided.
Right. Thank you so much for detailed answer. Let me ask a question addressed to Paul. So practical question. Coming from a fairly small but growing organization, is it worth building out rolling forecasts in Excel rather than waiting for investments into more advanced technology? So if you are small and growing, is it worth to build it first in Excel, or we still need to wait for more advanced technology? What do you think?
That's always a balance. It's always a very difficult one. I mean, everybody will start with Excel, and why not? You know, it's down to the point where you feel as though there's a number of people that are involved in this process, and I have no visibility of what's going on. I think that becomes the big challenge. That could be pretty small. You know, there could be anything between 5 and 10 users throughout the business, but they often, you know, there's often a lot of people that are involved in that process, and sometimes it's useful just to get their input. Sometimes they don't necessarily have to manipulate the data, but they often want to be able to just view it as well. So I would say it's probably something in the region of when you've got about 10 people. You could do it with less, and it all depends on you as a business, but 10 is probably about the right kind of level that it's appropriate towards moving towards a real solid technology that supports rolling forecast.
Right. Thank you for giving us this rule of thumb and making this decision. I have another question that I want to ask all of you. Quite challenging one. Sonia, I will start with you. And the question is, how, in your opinion, FP&A skill set should change with transition to rolling forecasts? What do you think, Sonia?
Yeah, I think it definitely requires change as you think about it. But on the other hand, you know, what we are seeing is constant change in most organizations and most industries, right? I think the current environment is leading everyone to change and to adjust more and more. And if I think about my experience, we completely revamped the forecasting process, the driver-based, and how we think about the business in the past 2 years. And I expect it to completely change again in the next year or so, right? So moving to rolling forecast, I think is part of that. And the way I really think about it is more the journey. And I think you learn a lot along the way to the journey. And then it's a moving target, right? It's going to constantly evolve. And I don't think there is like an end state of rolling forecast per se, because it's going to be constantly changing.
Right. I really like this opinion. Constant change is more than just one single change to rolling forecast. But I'm wondering, what do you think, Maggie? How we should change our skill set?
Yeah, so change doesn't happen overnight, right? So given as leaders of finance and FP&A, we need to support all of our team in that transition. All of our FP&A counterpart need to understand that our role is not necessarily and primarily data crunching and spending hours and hours in front of spreadsheets, but actually how do we make use of the numbers and provide the right insights. And definitely moving into rolling forecasts in a more automated manner is the way to go. And building on Paul answering the previous question, it's actually not that also expensive, not expensive anymore to move to EPM, right? If you are an organization with 10 users, the cost will be relative to the 10 users and won't be necessarily hundreds of thousands per quarter or per year if you are a small company. So be that in mind. That's the you know, there is quite a lot of competition, but also the cost is also adapted to the size of your organization. And lastly, when you are doing that transition, make sure that you document your processes. Even if you are doing this in Excel, you can still do a relatively good forecasting in Excel if you are choosing the right driver, but also if you are having good documentation and it's driver based. Imagine you transition into EPM while most of your drivers are manual, and you put them into the EPM solution still with a lot of manual input, then what's the real benefits out of it? So look really at the root cause and try to improve first while, you know, using your current practices. It will just make the transition to EPM much faster and much smoother.
Right. I'm very curious to hear your perspective, Paul, from technology point of view, how we should change our skill set in FP&A.
So it is interesting. Both of my colleagues have touched on it. You know, the skill sets are still finance based, and it's that ability then to be able to interact with other parts of the business. It's finance professionals themselves are now becoming far more than just finance professionals. You know, they are definitely getting engaged across an entire business, as I touched on earlier. You know, there is definitely a need to engage with other parts of the business, and that, you know, going back, it's probably not that long ago, 5 to 10 years ago, the CEO had always been from a sales point of view. Well, actually now a CEO has probably come from a CFO background. And that's quite different. You know, there's been a far more closer understanding of the finance aspect of the business. And that becomes really, really, really relevant. You know, the finance individuals are becoming very, very, very important. They were always important, but they were, you know, in the past, potentially a little bit seen as being number crunchers. And with all the best, you know, respect in the world, that's how they were viewed. Now they're catalysts for change. You know, they're business transformation professionals, and I think that must be more exciting. As Mehdi said, you know, we touched on earlier, nobody wants to spend their hours crunching data from multiple spreadsheets, and you know, it's analysis and adding value from that point of view.
And I really like to finish at this optimistic note. Finance profession will be more and more exciting with this change of skill set, with this transition to new technology, and this use of rolling forecasts. For every one of you who don't have your questions answered, don't be upset. We will try to do our best and answer them in writing. Meanwhile, let me thank all our participants, all our speakers for their presentations, for their answers to our questions, for our discussions. Thank you for being here. Let me invite our audience to FP&A Empowerment Survey. There is a short link in the handout. Please join it. Please join it in your free time. It won't take more than 10 minutes. Let me invite you to the next upcoming webinar very soon, April 12th. We will be speaking about transforming FP&A processes through advanced analytics. And let me thank our sponsor again for making these events possible. JEDOX is a modern enterprise performance management. For all of you who want to connect to FP&A Trends global community, there are plenty of ways to do so. Please choose the one that fits you best. We will be very happy to be connected. And please fill in the very short feedback form right after this webinar ends. Your opinion is very important for us to improve. Thank you for being here tonight with us. Have a good evening. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.